Hi, welcome back to Celebrating Culture. We're here today at the Brick Oven Cafe in Kenner, Louisiana, and I'm with Michela Musolino. Michela is a Sicilian songstress. Your knowledge of Sicilian music history is just overwhelming to me, so I'm so grateful you're on the show.
Thanks for having me. Well, if we go back to about 350 BC, we have a historian by the name of Timaeus, and he was from Taormina, and he recorded a lot of history of the ancient world, of ancient Sicily and ancient Greece. And he talked to us about itinerant celebrations that would take place throughout the night. They would involve music and dancing. They sprang out of religious rituals, which pretty much all our traditions of music came from originally religious rituals. We can start seeing a pattern with this idea of the music and the itinerant musicians and celebrations and the secular music growing out of religious rituals. And then if we jump forward a little bit, we could look at the court of King Frederick II, Re Federico II, and he was also called the Stupor Mondi. He was the wonder of the world because of the way he led the world in art and literature. So his court was a center for literature, and it's believed that the sonnet was born in his court. And it's something that was called the Ottava Siciliana. So it's 11 syllables, hendecasyllabic, which is very indicative of a sonnet. And it's 8 lines that rhyme A, B, A, B, A, B. And that we know is the first 8 lines of a sonnet. And why is that so important? Because most of Sicilian folk music and traditional music is in that form, that structure.
Also, during this period here, we get into the 12th and 13th century. You were talking about like barbers and the songs for the fishing. Tell us some of that background.
In Sicily, barbershops were a social center too. It wasn't just a place for men to get their haircut. It was a place for men to congregate, and there was music. Typically, barbers were musicians. Why is this important? Well, it's a very old tradition in Sicily, and the first time it was documented was in 1491. It's a document from Messina, and it talks about a barber. His name was Gregorio di Berto. He tells the story that he had a student, and he was teaching his student vocal compositions with musical accompaniment. And this is seminal for the work that we do because, first of all, it's the first time that the barber was referred to not only as a profession, but as a profession that was involved with music. It was identified barber and music. And it also identified the fact that this student was being taught from the body of Sicilian songs. So in 1491, already the world was identifying Sicily as having its own kind of music, as having a repertoire that was particular to Sicily.
Coming to you today at Aidan Gill for Men Barbershop. This is a phenomenal place. It looks like it's 1917 when jazz was being created and barbers sang. I'm with Shane Lief. Shane has his master's, 2 masters, one in musicology and one in language. He's working on his PhD in language, and he's written a book called Jockomo about the Mardi Gras Indians. Shane, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
There's a gentleman you wrote an essay about, Antonio Maggio.
Yes.
Tell me about him.
Okay, so Antonio Maggio, a man who's born in Cefalù, Sicily back in 1876. He's known as composing the first blues song with 12-bar blues and blues in the title that was published.
And what's the name of the song again?
I Got the Blues.
I understand he comes over and he's actually a barber.
In 1876, he's born in Cefalù, comes over in 1892. He's in New Orleans for a bit. His brother Rosario, who's older, has a barbershop. And when he's at the barbershop, he's entertaining people by singing operatic arias just out of the blue.
Years ago, barbers sang.
Absolutely. He was working at the barbershop. He was playing music with his friends, playing guitar, mandolin. He was a multi-instrumentalist. Buddy Bolden was active in the jazz scene. And he would hang out at the barbershop of George Galloway, only 2 blocks away from where Maggio was at the Poitras Market sometimes. So these guys, they definitely met and they overlapped in their work. When I read about this and I think about these songs and I hear them, It's like the Italians of New Orleans were just oozing musicality. It all came from the old country. It's almost like it was just in their bones, because when Maggio would go to the barbershop, he would be singing these operatic arias just out of the blue because it's just in him. And so when he comes to New Orleans, it makes perfect sense that he's curious about this guy, this older black man on the levee playing the guitar, and he incorporates that into his, what he calls an up-to-date rag. You know, I got the blues. And, you know, we can call it blues, ragtime, proto-jazz, whatever we want to call it. It's that mixture of different groups of people who are listening to each other and they're impacting each other. This is more like an acoustic illustration of what he might have heard on the levee, right? So. So something like that, you know, that's what he's hearing. And then when he goes home and he's like, oh, maybe I'll like make it more into like a rag. It's like. Something like that, so he's transforming it into a rag. Maggio, as a person, as an individual, seems to embody this marvelous trajectory of Italian speakers who come to the United States, become American, but they still retain a lot of their culture.
Shane, I want to thank you for being on the show.
You.
In New Orleans, we had the funeral marches.
There was a historian, his name was the Marchese of Villabianca. In the mid-1700s, he was already identifying this tradition of having musicians and singers at funerals in Sicily, and he already identified it as a well-established tradition. One of the things that was interesting is that in around 1661, the Jesuits in Palermo started a tradition of what we call the Orbi, and Orbi means blind or the blind men. In that culture, it was an agrarian culture, so it was felt that these young boys would be at a disadvantage. How could they survive? How could they have a family if they were blind? So the Jesuits trained them musically. And the idea was they would be hired to make music for the sacred events. Among the events they would make this music for would also be, they would play the novenas and they would play them at the funerals. It was identified as starting around 1661. And typically they were sent out in 2 by 2. It grew, eventually they would add more musicians, and eventually these itinerant musicians would also not necessarily all be blind. It started out as something that would help the blind men, and that continued really into the 20th century.
Eterno Redentore, Cristo duci, dammi la forza e non m'abbandonare. Quanto canto con gloria ed amore dell'Eterno Padre, la sua divina luce. Di la Trinità Santissima Divina, lo Dio figliolo in seconda persona, tra questa macchina fragile e meschina fece all'uomo e con l'uomo s'accomuna. Ci fu Madre Maria, sua regina, a San Giuseppe per figlio si dona. Si fa chiamare in questa parte fascia figlio di un artigiano mastro d'arte.
So that evolved into the second line.
So it has ancient roots, goes back to the 1400s and the 1600s.
Michela, I want to thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Stay tuned. We'll be right back with more of Celebrating Culture.
Dopo lo suo felice nascimento, sono io con San Giuseppe patio tanto, tra fanno bene guai, tra voglia e stento. Alle 30 anni circa come canto, Gesù per dare fine allo sontento, a Giuseppe e Maria fa riverenza così di casa sua finché spartenza. La penitenza mise a predicare, a così diceva ad ogni creatura, ognuno deve penitenza fare a ciò che si sradica l'errore. E ora mettiamo un poco a contemplare di Giuseppe e di Maria lo suo dolore, pensando che per te l'oggetto caro restare tutti lui con pianto amaro.